welcome to Journeys and Journals. I'm Bernie Martin Beck, and I get to go down the river today. I've got my old felt hat, and my guest is going to tell us the truth about the early history on the Rogue River and the Umpqua. So, welcome to our show. This is a privilege. You don't live here locally, but you've got a lot of stories. So where did that all come from?
Well, it came from doing a doctoral dissertation at Vanderbilt on Zane Grey, and then going on from there to become the foremost authority on his life, and then publish Zane Grey's West as a magazine from 1979 to 91. Co-found the society 1983 till now. And this will be my 28th keynote address when we meet. Our convention is going to meet for the second time in Oregon this coming June of 2010 in Gold Beach, where the Rogue hits the ocean.
Now, where was it last year?
Last year we met in a place called Mormon Lake. Gray camped there. It's a lake that's dry a good share of the year. It's between Flagstaff and the Muggy and Rim country.
And the year before and the year before?
The year before that, we met in Glacier National Park in those wonderful wooden lodges. Gray actually did some of the writing for Desert of Wheat in one of those lodges. And the year before that, we met at Lackawaxen, Pennsylvania on the Delaware River, where he did his earliest writing.
And people they're devoted to his writing. How many books did he write?
Probably altogether about 89.
Now, he didn't set out to be an author.
No, he didn't set out. He, in fact, as he grew up in Zanesville, Ohio, named after his maternal ancestor, just a typical boy, and loved to play baseball. Baseball was the hot rage at that time. And he was a splendid pitcher. As time went on, he had a showdown with his father, who was a dentist. And his father insisted, "You're going to have a career. Baseball's no career. Writing could be no career." He was interested in writing then too. So he lost the showdown.
And went to dental school.
He went to dental school, University of Pennsylvania. But he played in one of their greatest baseball teams of all time during those 4 years. Graduated with a dental degree. And he had an opportunity to almost walk into Cooperstown because he was so good. But a young lady came into his life about this time by the name of Dolly. And she was at what they call the Delaware House on the Delaware River in 1900, one memorable day in August. And Gray and his brother R.C., or Romer, they were inseparable. They were canoeing along the Delaware, and they saw 3 pretty girls along the bank. And Gray, neither of the boys could pass that up, so they veered in, started talking, and out of that came the 5-year romance with Dolly. Dolly was living in New York, and Gray set up a practice there in New York during those years. And the 5-year romance blossomed into marriage, and they married in 1905. In 1906, they honeymooned, took a train trip across the U.S. into the Rockies, and the train brought them to the brink of the south rim of the Grand Canyon. And the time leading up to this, Gray had written Betty Zane, set in the Ohio Valley. There's a book about his own ancestors, written Spirit of the Border, the second one, The Last Trail. So his west was the Ohio Valley region. But that evening, the bank of clouds dissipated. They walked to the parapet, looked down at the Grand Canyon at what looked like the end of the world with an incredible explosion of the sunset colors. And he had this vision, now this is the West. And that was about halfway through his life. That looking out of El Tovar into the Grand Canyon gave him a concept, oh, there must have been a real West once. And the real West is not the Ohio Valley I've known. It's got to be this country. So they went on to California. He fished off Catalina, went down to the Del Coronado Hotel. Dolly had had an inheritance coming, by the way, which is what enabled them to do all this.
Oh, because
Because he didn't have much money.
his heart wasn't in dentistry, was it?
No. So anyway, they came back. And out of that came, oh, I'm not satisfied anymore with the Ohio Valley. So there was a gentleman named Buffalo Jones who
What a
was
name.
almost as famous as Buffalo Bill in those days. And during the 1870s, they almost killed off all of the buffalo in the plains because they were, you almost had this perception that if you kill the Indians, if you kill the buffaloes off, the Indians won't be self-sufficient anymore, which was true. And so they killed about 70 million buffalo during that period. And out of that, Buffalo Jones one morning woke up and, oh, buffalo are almost gone. Oh, I didn't want to kill them all off. And so he set about trying to save the last few buffalo. And out of that, he became eventually the curator of the Yellowstone herd. Well, he was speaking in New York at the Campfire Club one day, and Gray was there. And his latest idea was to go lassoing mountain lions on the rim of the Grand Canyon. And Gray thought, oh, that's incredible. Can I go along as your photographer and storyteller? That was worked out. And so in 1907, Gray took the train out to Flagstaff, and people were wearing guns on their hips, and it was a wild, wide open town then. There were no roads between Flagstaff and Salt Lake City in those days. At any rate, it took him about 8 days to go from there to the Lee's Ferry on the Colorado. So Gray walked into the Old West, and the cowboys treated him as a tenderfoot, played all their jokes on him. And so there was one gentleman named Jim Emmett who was kind of the wagon master of this whole thing. And Jim Emmett had a large family. He was a Mormon pioneer living on the river. And Gray was so captivated by him because he was a master of everything. He could fix anything. He could mend anything. He was also a semi-doctor for whatever need came to him, whether it was animal or human. And out of that, Gray created one of the greatest male characters in his entire fiction, in Heritage of the Deserts, August Nabb. And that, when you read Heritage of the Desert, you can sense the West as Gray was experiencing it.
Almost smell sagebrush.
You could almost sell it. And you see, that's the difference. Then there was no mass media as we know it. And so the average person, long days, very few vacations, say 12-hour days, many of them working 7 days a week, they could only dream that there were places like this. And so Gray could take 3 pages and describe sunset on the Grand Canyon or someplace in the West. And he could make you feel you were there. And so I've often likened his writing to a Bierstadt or Moran, only painting with words. And because he was able to capture that in books like Riders of the Purple Sage that came next, that generally considered to be the greatest Western ever written, he got into the best-selling list and stayed in there for a long, long time. Got into the big time. But way back when he was young, in Zanesville, there was a in those days, there was no Social Security. And so if you didn't have enough money, you were sent to the poor farm. And there was a man by the name of Muddy Miser who, that was what the kids of Zanesville called him, because they could see him at any given time out there with his fishing pole on the river. He became Gray's childhood mentor. And he gave Gray the vision that someday you're going to be the world's greatest fisherman. And you're going to travel all over the world and popularize fishing in a way that's never been done before. And he says, you know, Christ and his disciples fished, and there's nothing dishonorable about this particular profession. So when Gray hit the big time, he spent a good share of his time fishing Long Key, Florida, Tampico, Mexico, and then because he had fallen in love with Avalon during his honeymoon, they eventually built a home there in Avalon and did a lot of fishing out of there. Caught the first, I think it was about a 600 or 700 pound tuna off Nova Scotia. Then bought a yacht, a beautiful 300 and some foot yacht called Fisherman One. Went fishing down off Galapagos, up the coast of Central America. And then the vision was, okay, South Pacific. So he bought an estate in Tahiti. It's called Flower Point. Malcolm Forbes was the owner a number of years ago. He and I corresponded. And then New Zealand heard about, well, Gray's book. He was as popular in the South Pacific as he was here. He was popular all around the world. And so they said, come to New Zealand and popularize our fishing. So when he got off the ship, they thought he'd be having his twin guns and his cowboy hat and riding a horse off the ship. They were disappointed because he looked like anybody else. But he did write Tales of an Angler's El Dorado. Gray wrote about, I think about 8 or 9 true life adventure books that have to do with the deep seas. And Tales of Lonely Trails, the expeditions on land. Along this period, while he was popularizing the South Pacific, he was also being wooed by Australia. They said it's not fair for those renegades over there in New Zealand to get you while we don't. So he came there and popularized their deep sea fishing waters.
Well, you're an ocean away, but I kind of have a feeling it's going to tie in with us out west.
Because he loved the deep sea, but he reveled in rivers. His favorite river in New Zealand was the Tongariro, but he had only 2 favorite rivers in America, and they were the Rogue and the North Umpqua.
Oh, and you mean right here in our backyard?
Here. And he would come here to Oregon and had his favorite fishing spots that were named. He would name them all along the river where he would take his entourage. And he usually had an entourage.
And who were they? Like a
family,
cook?
Brother, moochers, anybody that wanted to be part of this caravan and be written up in the books. And so he usually had probably 25 to 35. It was almost a royal entourage.
And I hear that he'd sometimes come to our area and go into a restaurant and then say, oh, well, just put it on the tab. And he, you know, you'd end up being host to 25 people in the entourage. He was right here.
Uh-huh.
What, a mile from the studio, doing his Wild West stories, or loading up, going down the river to what?
Well, one of the large photographs that I have in my collection, which, by the way, it was just recently one of the most significant collections in America, was purchased by Brigham Young University because they have developed they want to have the world's greatest collection of Zane Grey because so many of his books were set in Arizona, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, the Four Corners region. And that is a photo, it was written up in Country Gentleman, of Gray's party shooting the Rogue in the days before Rogue was undammed, and it was a wild, wild river. And you took your life in your hands to shoot it during the springtime when it was thundering down. And so that hung in our house for a long time, that Rogue, wonderful, well, it was probably about this wide by this high, so it was a great picture.
Well, if you have a snapshot of that, you send it out west, because I'd be interested. Now, he had this love for wild things, huh? Didn't matter if it was fishing or...
Well, you know, he was also a naturalist. He was interested in everything. I remember in one of the books that he wrote, he was talking about the little caddisfly that only survives a day in life, and yet that captivated him. Well, what is it about a little fly that only has in its existence one day as a human would perceive it? And he felt, well, there had to be a place for the caddisfly. As he was walking along the beach, he would study everything. If he was fishing, he would be looking for a new species of fish he'd never seen before. When he was in Mexico, he decided to be an explorer and go down the Santa Rosa River. And he got treed by javelinas that are little wild boar. And he just about didn't ever come back because they weren't about to ever let him out of the tree alive. So he had this urge to go where nobody had ever been before. And George Reiger, who is longtime editor at Field and Stream, has said that Zane Grey, strange as it may seem because he's known around the world for his fascinating novels about the West, he may be known as much in the future for his true life adventure stories. When Grey was fishing the seas, there was an abundance of wildlife and sharks and whales and all kinds of other fish that will never happen again because we're fishing the seas to extinction now.
So that's the story of the shark.
Well, the shark I had also in my office. There was a period of time in which Grey sent copies of his books to Ernest Hemingway. And Hemingway was another person that was very macho, and they had talked about an around-the-world fishing trip with the two of them, which would never have worked because they were both prima donnas. One of them would have pushed the other overboard. But in Hemingway's Old Man in the Sea is an interesting story about this man fishing from this little boat that eventually catches the biggest fish he's ever caught. Well, Grey sent a copy of Tales of Tahitian Waters to Hemingway, and in that he tells the story of day after day after day of not catching anything. And then finally, after this many days, Hemingway one-ups him, puts one day more than Grey had. He catches this world record Tahitian marlin that was approximately 1,250 pounds when he first caught it. The sharks got to the tail. And in Hemingway's The Old Man at Sea, he one-ups him there. He has the sharks, sharks having a feeding frenzy, and they completely clean the skeleton off. But out of that, that photograph was flashed around the world, and as were all of Zane Grey's exploits in those days.
Now, you know, it's kind of a household word around town. Why here when you're talking around the world? Why here in our little...
Well, I would say because of all, if you take the whole world, you take the whole nation, you take the one state in America in which Gray fell in love with one of its rivers, and then you double that and say 2 of its rivers, and went back during his adult lifetime virtually every year to those rivers, he didn't feel that a year could go by without being regenerated by either the Rogue or the North Umpqua. And he would write about these rivers, and from all over the world, the Rogue and the North Umpqua became known as great fishing rivers because Gray loved them so much in his magazine writing, because he was, when he wrote, magazine was king. We understand, oh, television is king, or the cinema is the king, but when Gray was writing, there was no television. Cinema was new, black and white, those jittery things that you watch. But the average person, if you were growing up during this time period, you would go and sit by the mailbox because there would be the latest Saturday Evening Post, the latest Collier's, the latest Ladies' Home Journal, McCall's, all of these wonderful magazines that had these serialized stories. And you would be brought to the very edge of something exciting next week. So you'd have to wait all the way till next week to get that next magazine. And so because of that, he was the highest paid author in the world in magazines as well. They would pay huge prices because if they had Zane Grey on the cover of the magazine, they were guaranteed to sell bukus.
And they even put it on the marquees?
In the theater marquees, Zane Grey, where the film story came from, was twice as big as the stars. That has never been done for anybody else.
He was an important man about town. I just happened to stop by the Forest Service and picked up this little Rogue River Trail, and you can walk all the way down on the Rogue River, but you can raft it. Now, how did Zane Grey get down the river?
Well, he took a lot of expeditions, and by horseback.
Ah.
And this is one, I have never seen this before, but a lot of these I can recognize because Zane Grey named them. And I see here the Zane Grey cabin at Winkle Bar. And I've been contacted by the BLM, Bureau of Land Management, because they are now in the process of popularizing Gray's presence in Oregon and making this Zane Grey country and these 2 rivers an integral part of what we know as Oregon in the West. And so this is a wonderful little map here. Taille, that's one that Gray talked about a great deal in his fishing. Whiskey Creek was another. And any Zane Grey aficionado would love this. So thank you for giving that to me.
You're very welcome. I found newspaper articles in Oregon Motorist all about this. Glenn Woolridge and his connection with Zane Grey. I talked to one dear lady. She said, oh yes, his river guide, and she gave me his name, and I'll put it here in print. It was a new name to me, but he was Zane Grey's regular river guide. Mm-hmm. Because you didn't just hop on the river in your little rowboat like this. I mean, they had special boats because the rocks are pretty rough on boats. Mm-hmm. What did he do down there besides fishing? Now, these are Bill Young's fishing poles, dear friend of mine who passed away. And at his auction, I said, oh, I just have to have a little something of Bill's, but, you know, they're vintage.
Well, he would even fish in very hot days. And it was one day along the North Umpqua in 1937 when he had his first stroke. It was 100 degrees in the shade that day, and it took him a long time before he had to dictate his books after 37 for most of that time period. And he was just recovering in '39 when he got the fatal one. But he loved fishing enough to be fishing when it was 100 degrees in the shade.
Wow. Now you do write books.
70 of them now.
70 books.
Yeah.
And part of your books that I fell in love with, you take old stories.
I love old stories. People measure the collections that we do by Kleenex. They say, is it a 5 Kleenex, a 4, or a 3? It better be a 5. And that's the reason why Christmas in My Heart is the longest running Christmas series in America today, is that you bawl a lot when you read the stories, and also it takes you somewhere you've never been before.
Now, these are not original stories. Where did you come up with them?
Well, there are stories that I've collected through the years. People send me stories. I buy up old magazines, old books, and I have contemporary writers that write also. The single common denominator is that for every story that makes it in, there are between 1 and 500 that can't. And because I feel that so many people just write stories that are stories that are stories. But once in a while you come across one that slams you against the wall and you can never get that story out of your head. Those are the stories I look for.
Well, I just have to share with you that my niece Heidi, a Christmas tradition, is to take one of these stories and read it aloud. I'd love to have you read aloud to us, maybe next time. But Zane Grey is the reason that you're here, the reason that we got acquainted, the reason that the Rogue and the Umpqua became famous world around. Is that true?
That is true.
And the cabin, we were going to go down, and there's no way to get there, but a 5-hour round trip on the bumpy road.
I haven't been there yet, but I want to one of these days.
And then an hour's walk in. I'm looking forward to it. But so come back. Come back again. I'm Bernie Martin Beck, and I get to talk to the most fascinating people. Dr. Wheeler. That doesn't sound quite right.
Joe Wheeler's fine.
You've come a long way to come to Southern Oregon and share bits of courage, and these Christmas stories have just brought a smile to so many of us. Keep up the good work. I'm Bernie Martin Beck saying bye for now. Thanks for tuning in.